I'm the Executive Director of Family Education and Support Services. And also joining me behind the scenes, our tech support, Jacob Tillett, is here. And I want to give a special thanks to Heather Antonitis and to Lindsay Polanco, who have helped make this conference happen. We're here to support our speakers today. And if you have any problems during the session, please use the chat box to send a message and we'll do what we can to best address the issue. I want to make sure and say thank you to our sponsors who made today possible, and a big thank you to our grant sponsors, the Division of Children, Youth, and Families, and the Chehalis Tribe. Also supporting our efforts today are Lewis County Health Department, Amera Group, WSECU, Olympia Federal Savings, Kaiser Permanente, MultiCare, Capital Medical Center, Community Foundation, First Security Bank, Seattle Children's, South Puget Sound Community College, Nicholson and Associates, and Port Blakely. We literally could not have done it without their support and guidance. We also have community partners who helped us get the word out and connect with the community. We want to thank Child Care Action Council, SPSCC's Parenting Education Program, and I'm going to ESD 113, Autism Coalition, and Parent Map. For those earning CEU credits today, we'll be tracking your attendance through Zoom. We'll ask that you please fill out the survey at the end of the conference, and this will confirm your workshop attendance as well as provide us with additional information that we need to process. During our sessions today, we'll request that you use the chat box for presenter questions or comments. In doing so, we ask you to help us by using the capital Q before your question, and our speakers will do their best to address all questions. For more detailed or case-specific questions, we encourage you to message our speaker through Zoom, the event platform. All of today's live sessions are being recorded and will be posted on our Zoom event platform within the next week, along with PowerPoints and any additional resource materials. You'll be able to access them through our end of December, and then we'll have to close them down, but contact us if you need more information. To assist with our recording, we ask that all attendees stay on mute unless asked otherwise. We do encourage you to turn your cameras on if you're able to. It's helpful for the speakers to see you. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for our keynote presentation, Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. She is the founder and director of the Trauma Stewardship Institute and author of a book called Trauma Stewardship: An Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others, and also The Age of Overwhelm. Widely recognized as a pioneer in the field of trauma exposure, she has worked locally, nationally, and internationally for more than 3 decades. We're absolutely thrilled to bring to you Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. Laura?
Great, thank you. Just give me 1 second. I have to move one thing real quick. Give me 1 sec.
You bet. This is a good time to check your chat box. Please feel free to put your name and your agency in the chat box. Great to see Togethers here, DCYF, DOC, Fess is in the house.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Shelley. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to get to have some time with you all today. I know I get to see you all for this time and then some of you in the workshop. So what I want to do, because I want this to be as interactive as possible, and I want to make sure that whatever material I'm covering feels to you all like it's the best use of your time today, I want to take a few minutes and hear from you any requests that you might have. So I'm going to pull up my chat here. So I have this. I also think you all have the capacity to come on mic. So let me describe to give you a little bit of the lay of the land of the topic I'm talking about, and then I would love to hear from you all any particular requests you have. Essentially, what I get to talk with you all about this morning is this idea of cumulative toll. So we're not going to get super clinical with it, but sometimes we call it vicarious trauma, sometimes we call it compassion fatigue, sometimes we call it vicarious post-traumatic stress. But essentially what we're looking at is this idea of when you're exposed to really hard things over time, what is that cumulative toll? You can be exposed to hardship, suffering, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, the planet. We know there's a cumulative toll, and it's a toll on us individually, it's a toll on us collectively, it's a toll on us personally as well as professionally. I think it goes without saying, but if I had the joy of being with you all, a little over 3 years ago, we would have had plenty to talk about. I don't imagine any of you would have said you were in a state of nirvana then. But there's a pandemic that's come in, seems to be staying. There's all this systematic oppression and structural supremacy surfacing. Obviously, none of that's new, but surfacing in awful ways. Climate crisis, also not new, accelerating. I'm not going to presume to know where any of you all are at politically, but regardless, I don't know anybody who's psyched about what's happening with our democracy. So you have your personal lives where you probably got a ton of caretaking going on. You got your jobs, your careers, likely lots going on there. You have these 4 additional layers. And the reason I bring that up is because all of that provides this larger context for what this cumulative toll can look like. Many of you joining us here this morning, I know, are primary trauma survivors. You've been through primary trauma in your own life. And primary trauma can be a lot of things, but it's generally not confusing when a primary trauma is happening. But part of what's really hard about the conversation we're having is we're talking about that accumulation over time. And part of what that means is it can be really hard to gauge that anything's happening because you don't lose your sense of humor overnight. You don't become numb over a weekend. You don't become cynical on any given afternoon. It is a day in and a day out exposure. And it's as a result, like I said, of what you have in your personal lives, what you've got going on perhaps at work, but all these other factors as well. So I get 45 minutes with you for the keynote. I want to make sure that whatever I'm covering feels to you all like it's a good use of your time. So 2 questions I have for you. We're just going to take a couple minutes and do this, and then we will dive in. But I would like to hear any requests you have for this specific topic. Those of you I'm in the workshop with will regroup later too. But for this specific topic right now, anything you'd like me to cover in this keynote along the lines of cumulative toll, vicarious trauma. Sometimes when we're really overwhelmed, we have no idea what we want covered or what would be helpful. So if that's the case, it would help me just to hear from you. How are you? How are spirits? How's your morale? What feels like it's weighing on your heart? What's going on for you? So go ahead and put things in the chat. And if anybody would like to come on mic, go ahead and do that. And we'll just take a couple minutes and do this. Also, if you don't want to speak in front of your 77 esteemed colleagues, you can also go ahead and direct message me and I'll get that. So the 2 questions, anything in particular for this keynote that you would like covered on the topic of cumulative toll, vicarious trauma, or just give me a sense of how you're doing. So come on mic if you want, just go ahead and jump on mic or go ahead and put things in the chat. Great, I'm seeing what's coming in. And you can direct message me as well. Anything else you're interested in terms of cumulative toll, vicarious trauma? Or anything you want to just tell me, give me a sense of how you're doing. I'm so grateful for the platform so we can do this work during a pandemic. And also it's really hard to tell over the platform how anybody's doing as opposed to if I was in a room with you. So it also gives me sense. It's helpful for me to have a sense about how you're doing. Great. The direct messages are coming too. So that's wonderful. Okay. Very helpful. Thank you. And if anybody wants to come on mic, go ahead.
Good morning, Laura.
Hey there.
Cassie at Family Education Support Services, the clinical director for our parent-child assistance program. I know our team works directly in direct services with clients who have a lot of trauma, and we often they offload that onto us and kind of ask us to help carry their load of that trauma. And we work really hard as a team together to then let our case managers offload it But I think that it gets to a point sometimes, especially now with like winter and it's getting darker and things seem to get harder. Just in general, any new ways or something that we can just support the continued kind of offload and how that just keeps going, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Great. Thank you so much, Cassie. Really, really helpful. Thank you. And other folks, I'm seeing what's coming in, so that's great. Okay, this is really, really helpful. Thank you so much. Request from me, I think Heather and Shelly have mentioned this in a couple different places, but if folks can have their cameras on, it helps me so much. I'm old school. I miss being with you all in person. Even if you're multitasking, it's fine. You can be walking the dog, taking care of your kids, cooking breakfast, but it just helps me so much to pretend we're in a room together. So anybody who can't have their camera on, you can totally multitask, but just it helps me a lot. Okay, so let's do this. What I want to do then, just given what's coming in the chat, what Cassie's saying, and what the direct messages are saying, I want to primarily focus my keynote time on strategies. So before we put up the first handout, I can share with you that what I'm going to go through for a few minutes are some of the most common manifestations of how we know when we're impacted, what that can look like and what it can look like I said, individually, collectively, personally, and professionally. Okay. Before we put that circle up though, because it's a bit of a schlep to go through and it can be a little daunting, I want to share with you the reasons that I want to start with this circle, because I want you to not leave here feeling more overwhelmed than when you came in. So the few reasons I want to spend time on these manifestations to start with are, number one, you all know this so well given the work you're doing, of course, but one of the most damaging things when it comes to anything related to trauma, anything related to oppression of any kind and overwhelm, is when folks feel isolated. Even if you're not isolated, it's the feeling of being isolated, it's the perception that you're isolated. So one of the most important things for me this morning to be able to offer you all is a reminder that if you're experiencing anything I talk about during my time with you all, you're in very good company. All right. So if you ever wake up and feel, am I the only one who feels this sad? Am I the only one who feels like I can't parent my own kids one more day? Am I the only one who has this much rage coursing through me? I just want you to know, whatever you got going on, you are in really, really, really good company. The second reason I want to spend a few minutes on these manifestations is because, as I said earlier, while many of you might have survived primary trauma in your life, part of what's hard with cumulative toll and vicarious trauma is because it is slow moving, it is hard to gauge when we're impacted. I want to lighten your cognitive overload. I want to decrease your cognitive overload. So I think it can be helpful just to have a single visual to look at, which is what we're going to walk through. What many folks are doing with this visual is using it at the beginning of staff meeting for a few minutes. If you're part of a staff, a unit, a department, doing a structured check-in with it. You definitely want it to be structured so it doesn't turn anybody's counseling session, but just taking a few minutes at the beginning and be like, all right, team, how's our fatigue this week? Okay, team, how's our negativity bias? And in that way, part of what we're doing is interrupting isolation, but we're also trying to decrease the stigma around it. Those of you who are based at home, I don't think it needs to go on your refrigerator, okay? But those of you who are in a workplace, I would wallpaper your workplace with it. And then the last thing I want to say about it is I don't know how you're doing other than what you're sharing with me, which is exceedingly helpful. But everywhere else I'm working, every field I'm working in, every country I'm working, what folks are reporting is an increase in irritability, an increase in aggravation, an increase in frustration, an increase in hostility, a decrease in patience, a decrease in grace, a decrease in equanimity. And so I think that's the other reason I want to spend a few minutes on these manifestations. So if you are finding yourself exceedingly frustrated, exceedingly aggravated, exceedingly impatient in your personal lives, in your caretaking, at work, that it's not going to solve everything, obviously, but it can maybe help just bring down the temp a little bit and provide us with a bit more context. Even if you're not best friends with your colleagues, even if you don't like a relative, but at the very least, this might help remind you of you know what? They've got a lot going on. I've got a lot going on, and we can kind of help depersonalize this a little bit. Whereas in our society right now, there's such a reductive analysis and there's so much personalization happening. So those are the reasons I want to spend a few minutes on this. Okay, so Heather or Shelly or whoever my wonderful tech support is, if you can put up that circle right now, that when experiencing overwhelm, that's great. Thank you, Jacob. Oh, great. Okay, perfect. And I believe that you all have received this as well. So if you did not get this, don't stress, or if you don't know where to find it, don't stress. We will get this to you and point you to it. But right now we're going to screen share it. And again, if you haven't gotten a copy or you don't know where to locate it, don't worry, we will find it for you. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take just a few minutes and I'm going to go through this circle. And then what I want you all to do when I'm done going through the circle is I just want to hear from you any questions you have, and we can have a little bit of discussion at that time. Okay. So again, when you're looking at this and when I roll through it, just a reminder that these are ways you can be impacted personally as well as professionally, individually, collectively. So personally, you can feel tired. Professionally, you can feel tired. Individually, you can feel cynical. Collectively, you can feel cynical. And the other thing I want to say about this, which I probably don't need to, but it is very easy for this portion of my time with you to kind of sit back, cross your arms, and just obsess the whole time about anyone else who you think should be here for this section more than you should be, right? And so kind of you have that voice in your head of like, you know who should be here for this part is my boss. And as I'm looking around at the 86 people, I don't know why he couldn't show up. And you know who should be here is my mother-in-law, right? So I'm going to just encourage you to try to be self-reflective during this time and don't spend the whole time obsessing on other people who you think need this part of the conversation more than you do. All right. It's really a good idea to have a sense of humor as we go through this. You also want to be like in any way, not self-deprecating. And you also want to be as compassionate with yourself as you can. So kind of have an anthropological David Sedaris voice in your head. Okay. But don't be hard on yourself as we go through this. I'm not having the chat pulled up while I do this. So if anything's confusing, just come on mic. Okay, and just interrupt me because I'm not going to look at the chat while I go through this. Okay, so up top is a sense of feeling helpless and hopeless and feeling like you can never do enough. So in Spanish, we say no vale la pena. This is that experience of like, does anything I'm doing matter? You can feel like you're not grandparenting enough. You can feel like you're not a good enough colleague. You can feel like you're not a good enough parent. You can feel like you're not a good enough supervisor. Whatever it is, you just feel like no matter what you're doing, you feel like you're never, ever, ever doing enough. You always feel like you should be doing more. All right. Now, the larger conversation when we have more time, which maybe we'll talk about in the workshop or another time, is I have us look at this idea of internalized depression, messages we got way back in the day about what it means to be who we are. And when we internalize that misinformation, we can kind of go through our life unconsciously, even with a sense of not enoughness, that we feel like the essence of who we are is not enough. Right. And then part of what happens is if we're in a workplace of any kind, or if we're in a family of any kind, or a community where there's a sense of scarcity, where we haven't figured out how to prioritize sustainability, and there's kind of that frenetic sense, then that can collide with our own sense of not enoughness. And it's where you can feel like you're losing your mind. Okay. So what we look for in a workplace is a workplace that really prioritizes sustainability, a workplace that really makes sure we don't, get caught up with martyrdom, okay, and like have an employee of the year recognition event, and you're the employee of the year, you never said no, thanks for pushing through COVID and mono and shingles and coming into work every day, here's a plaque, right? Like that's not the workplace you want to be in. And we also want to be a part of movements, a part of communities that really focus on sustainability. But this piece, okay, of feeling like you're not doing enough, feeling like you always should be doing more, this is a piece that can be really, really challenging. Okay, now several on the right-hand side have to do with your nervous system, all right? Hypervigilance, where you're having a hard time regulating your nervous system, or you feel very serious all the time. if you slide down their fight, flight, freeze response, dissociation, those are real nervous system experiences. Okay. And then sliding up again to where it says anger and cynicism. Of course, the issue is not that you're angry at all. The issue is that most of us, if you were raised in the United States, did not get a lot of support and skill in terms of how to do anger well. So frequently it will manifest as passive aggressiveness or it will manifest as cynicism. I don't know any of you personally, so you all seem very delightful. None of you might navigate this like raw cynicism, but what I bet a lot of you can relate to is cynical humor. I don't worry about you engaging in cynical humor as long as you're able to say, I'm angry, my whole family's angry, my team is angry, my workplace is angry. We laugh all the time, all right? And you're connecting anger to cynical humor. But what I do worry about is when I work with folks, they're like, we're not angry. We're just super funny people over here. So you want to keep an eye on that in terms of the cynicism. Guilt is the next one. You can imagine all the ways that we might feel guilty, fear, all the ways we might feel fearful, and then there's complicated grieving. So in the United States, I don't want to totally overgeneralize, but I don't think anybody looks to the United States as having a strong suit and grieving and mourning culture. So any of you who have ever grieved or mourned, you know, even for loss of life, we get very, very, very little support, even for loss of life. Right. And so you can imagine for all the other things that there are to grieve and mourn in your work, in your life, that there's very little support for that. I talk about this all the time anyway, but over the last 3 years, it has really, really brought to the surface in our country what it means to not have a lot of support around grief and loss. Lack of awe is an important one for quality of life. It's also, there's some really interesting research around awe. So lack of awe is, let's say where you were this morning, maybe the sun rose in a really beautiful way. Let's say this upcoming weekend, you get to spend time with your 3-year-old granddaughter. I'm sure you all are very grateful people. So intellectually, you're like, the sunrise, so pretty. My granddaughter, I love my granddaughter. But you're not feeling it. It's the difference between being able to register it in your mind and actually feeling a sense of awe. The next one is sense of persecution. Sometimes this is individual, but we often see this in like your whole team is persecuted. Your whole department feels persecuted. Fight, flight, freeze, I mentioned, and dissociation, I mentioned. Again, the challenge is not that you experience that. The challenge is, if any of you grew up driving stick shift, or maybe you still drive stick shift, that experience of grinding the gears. So it's not that you dissociate now and then. It's not that you're in fight, flight, freeze now and then. It's that you don't go fluidly in between them in your nervous system, and it's a gear grinding. The next one has to do with inability to see options and diminished creativity. Okay. Neuroscientists are going to tell you to be creative. You have to have time and you have to have space. Most of us probably feel like we don't have any time or space. Okay. But there's all these ways that you've been asked to be creative, just in general, and certainly over the last 3 years. Your in-laws moved in with you. They've never moved out. You had to homeschool your own kids. You had to do your job totally differently. There's all these ways you've had to be creative, but many people report that their brains just feel completely broken. All right. The next category, this is about how harm happens and manifests. And I want to spend a few extra minutes on this. This is a really important one for me. I know we all come to how we're spending our time, the work we're doing, the caretaking we're doing, for any number of reasons, for all different reasons, for any number of ways, right? But I'm going to just have an assumption that what we can all agree on is a shared ethic of doing no harm. As you're doing the job you're doing, you have an ethic of doing no harm. As you're taking care of your nieces and nephews, your grandkids, your own children, you have an ethic of doing no harm. Just how we are in the community, we have an ethic of doing no harm. So I'm going to assume we all have that ethic. One of the things that historically has been very hard, certainly in the workspace, and I also think just in the caretaking space, is there's been such a focus on how we show up kind of out there and the external way of doing what we're doing without a lot of support or focus on, as Stevie Wonder says, handling your business. All right. So if you think about kind of Chief Sealth's Web of Life or Martin Luther King's Single Garment of Destiny. There are all these parts of the web that are very compromised and impacted right now. For some of you, that's the caretaking you're doing. For some of you, those are the clients you're serving. For some of you, it's a whole combination. All right. But if you think about this web and all these parts of the web that are compromised out here, what many of us have been trained to do or socialized to do is like a hyper function with all the parts of the web out here that we need to tend to, but a lack of ability simultaneously to handle our business in our own immediate part of the web. So we're hyper focused out there, but we don't know how simultaneously to tend to our immediate part of the web. And we can forget over time that the reality of life is one web. That is the reality of life, is interbeing, which means there's one web, which means you can't be the parent you want to be. You can't be the grandparent you want to be. You can't be the aunt, uncle you want to be. You can't be the caretaker you want to be. You certainly can't be the worker you want to be if you are not handling your business and making sure that you're shoring up your part of the web, right? This is a really important thing to understand, because when I say we have the shared ethic of doing no harm, and imagine we all have a commitment to that, I bet many of you immediately default to this place of like, no, the way I'm doing my job, I'm still doing the best I can there, or I'm still like, prioritizing being a parent above all other, grandparent beyond all other. Obviously, I care about all of that tremendously, right? But I want you to know that the first place that we're going to notice you're overwhelmed, the first place we're going to notice the vicarious trauma or cumulative toll, the first place we're going to notice this impact, it is not on how you do your job, and it is not on how you parent or grandparent or aunt and uncle or any of that. The first place we're going to see harm, it is going to be in your own health. So this is part of the paradigm that we need to shift, is understanding if you're trying to gauge how things are going. I can tell you that the first place that you're going to see harm will be in your own health. Now let's leave kind of God forbid diagnoses aside over here. I want you to just think about these early indicators in health that many of us have gotten used to just turning down the volume on and ignoring. So for example, you used to never get a headache. Then you started getting a headache every 6 months. Now you have a headache every 6 minutes. But maybe you're somebody who just ignores those headaches and you're like, it's fine, it's just a headache, I'm not worried about this. If I was asked you all to just take a second right now and feel your jaw, many of you would notice that your jaw is quite sore, okay? You might be one of the many people who have emailed me over the last few years telling me how many teeth that you've cracked, right? But again, you might be somebody who's like, whatever, it's fine, I've got other teeth, I'm not worried about it. So you all know this experience in life where you can kind of turn down the volume, turn down the volume, turn down the volume on these early indicators until your health really hits a wall. Okay, so there's the physical health piece, the way your back hurts, the way you're super inflamed, the way your immune system and your adrenal system is crashing, right? But again, a lot of us just kind of blow that off until we have to tend to it. Now, connected with that, in terms of the first place you're going to see harm, is your own mental health, your own emotional health. I can tell you, everywhere I'm working, every country I'm working in, every field I'm working in, every community I'm working in, what folks say to me is something to the effect of, obviously I'm depressed, Laura. Everybody I know is depressed. Of course I'm anxious. Do you know anybody who's not anxious? Love humor, appreciate obviously that we're not isolated, but I just want to remind us that's not the baseline we're going for. It's not the baseline we're going for as colleagues that we're all depressed and anxious. It's not the baseline we're going for as caregivers that we're all depressed and anxious. Like, we don't want to just kind of settle in to a state, right, of depression and anxiety. Okay. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because it can be something that we get used to, and it can be something when you're looking around and everyone in your family is depressed and anxious, everyone in your community seems depressed and anxious, everyone in your job is depressed and anxious, that somehow there can be a way that we pay attention to it less. All right. Now, again, we never want to be isolated with it. Love humor around this. But I want us to remember that if you are noticing your depression and anxiety lingering, if you are noticing your panic disorder ticking up, if you're noticing your OCD increasing, right? These are all things we want to be very proactive and very preemptive about. Okay, so that is the first place you're going to see harm, is there. Not in your jobs, right? Not how you're showing up for the people you love, but it's going to be in your own health and mental health. The second place we see harm happening usually is in our personal relationships. Okay, so how you might be showing up at your work, right? Or with your volunteer commitments, you might still be doing great, but the way you are in your interpersonal interactions are really compromised a little bit. This is where I'm sure you all, maybe, if not, some of you can relate to this, have heard from your loved ones something to the effect of, I don't know how they say you're so good at what you do, like fill in the blank at your work, or your volunteer work, because in our home or in our interactions or in our relationship, you suck, right? So where people are kind of highlighting to you like that what they get from you is different than how you bring yourself other places, right? Okay, the third place we see harm happen if you're in a job, that this is in your colleague relationships. If you're in a volunteer commitment, this is with your relationships there. So you still might be doing solid in terms of kind of the quality of what you're giving work wise, right? Or kind of what you're putting out there in the community. But maybe you gossip about your colleagues. Maybe you roll your eyes at your fellow volunteers, right? Maybe you're not assuming well about the people who you're in relationship with. So that's where we see that kind of breaking down. The last place we see harm is actually in your parenting, in your grandparenting, in your caretaking, in the work you're doing. By the time any of that has become compromised or you feel like you're not bringing your A game, I think about it often like a mountaineering accident where there are all these indicators we should have paid attention to earlier. Okay. Happy to answer any questions about this. I'm going to go through the circle and then we'll have time for Q&A. The next one connected to this physical piece and emotional piece, of course, is chronic exhaustion. This is where not you're tired and you work out and feel better or take a nap and feel better. This is where you're tired in your spirit, you're tired in your bone marrow, you're tired in like your soul. You are convinced all your ancestors were tired people, right? And in your nervous system, you feel very saturated. The next one is confirmation bias and being pulled away from critical thinking. This is kind of a parallel process with our country where you get caught up in good, bad, right, wrong, you're with me, you're against me. You lose your ability to think expansively, and it might be hard to track this, but over time, you might notice that you only want to hang out with people who agree with you because you get a dopamine hit from those people. Right. And so you kind of can see like your world getting smaller and smaller in that regard. The next one is where you're not present, you're very avoidant, and you're really struggling with cognitive overload. Okay, you all so devoted, so dedicated. So can you fake being present as a parent? Sure. Can you fake being present as a caretaker? Totally. Can you fake being present on the job? Yeah. But this is where you're not bringing that quality of presence. The next one is something we added to this circle, right? So if this circle looks familiar to you, either because I've had the joy of getting to spend time with some of you all in the past, or because of trauma stewardship, we've added some things to the circle over the last several years. And this category is one of them, this feeling intense and rigid and controlling. One way I like to talk about this is unless you are a spiritually enlightened being, one of the things that's very hard about everything right now is how much is out of control, just the amount that's out of control and how much is out of our control. So one way you can think about this, it's as if you are using up your capacity to tolerate all those things that are out of your control, which are so challenging. You're using up your capacity to tolerate that where you must. And so now anywhere you can have control, you are getting hyper controlling. If you were to interview my children, they would allege they feel overparented by me, right? If you were to talk to my partner, you would hear stories about like how my like OCD in the kitchen is really at an all new level. Okay, some of you can relate to this in your own life, right? So this is where you might have this experience with your supervisor or a colleague where you're like, my colleague used to be so chill and now all of a sudden they're micromanaging me, right? Or you're at Trader Joe's and people feel intense. You're at Costco and people feel intense. You're at the farmer's market and people feel intense. Just this increase in intensity. The next one is where you feel disheartened and you feel dispirited. Like in your just presence, you feel it. It's a very palpable experience. You're at like, your neighbor's little pre-K assembly and it feels disheartened and dispirited. You're at your favorite park and it feels disheartened and dispirited. You're at your job, it feels disheartened and dispirited. The next one is grandiosity. This is a challenging one because it can be a bit complex. We want you to appreciate yourself always and be self-respecting. Also, we never want you going to this place of like, if I wasn't here, none of this would get done. Now, sometimes in caretaking, it is the case. Like if you're not there, it's like really likely to not get done. So I want to be mindful of this and not be cavalier about it, right? But I want us to be aware of that, even if we are feeling the sense of grandiosity, okay? And then certainly in our job, a lot of time we have that experience of like, if I was in here, this wouldn't get done. And so it's just something that we want to keep a very close eye on. The next one is also a parallel process with our country. This is called negativity bias or not assuming well. So this is where instead of the glass being half full, right, this is where you are having a hard time assuming well about others. Okay, you're sitting in staff meeting, a colleague goes to say something, you don't even listen to what your colleague's about to say. You just have a thought come into your head where you're like, what is this jackass about to say now, right? So you're just like negative thinking, negative thinking, negative thinking. You get a text from your sister-in-law, you don't even read the text. You're just like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. Okay, so it's that feeling of just like always being like, oh, glass being half empty. The next one is where you have a hard time empathizing or you feel numb. All right. Again, you all dedicated, devoted. Can you override it? Sure, you can. But this is where just organically you don't feel that empathy. And then connected with that, you're going to see written here is minimizing. Minimizing is not where we have context. It's not where we have perspective. It's definitely not gratitude. What minimizing is because of everything you've borne witness to over time, it's as if you've used up your capacity for like organic compassion and empathy, and you're kind of on energy conservation cycle. Okay, like an old appliance, right? And you're going to only apply that where to the folks who you think deserve it the most. So the first place you're going to turn it against yourself will be to you, right? So that's the first place is, let's say later today you have a headache. And you're like, oh, that lady Laura was super bossy this morning. I've got a headache. But then immediately you're like, why am I complaining? I'm not intubated in an ICU. I shouldn't complain about a headache, right? So it's not context or perspective. It's where you're super harsh against yourself. Like nothing you could be experiencing is going to be worth being compassionate to yourself around. Okay. The next place you're going to turn this is to your loved ones until your loved ones start kind of falling off and not talking to you anymore. So this is where a loved one comes to you and says something like, oh, I'm having a hard day. And you just pause and look at them and say, I'm sorry. Are you having a hard day? Would you like some stories about people who actually have hard days, right? So this is where you like turn it against your loved ones. The last place this would show up is kind of in your work itself, right? Where you might not actually ever say this, but you're kind of exuding it. The next category, I'm sure, is none of you all, so we can probably skip over this, but this is where we talk about sub-impeccable behavior and very toxic conduct. The next one, addictions. I know you all know this well, but I just want to remind you there's a huge continuum here with addictions. There's cocktail hour, of course. There's getting high regularly. There's pharmaceuticals you're on in an unmindful way. You also want to remember that you can be addicted to behavior. You can be addicted to being right. You can be addicted to being needed. You can be addicted to glass being half empty. You can be addicted to criticizing everybody and everything all the time, right? You can be addicted to being overscheduled. And then there's the classics, which are adrenaline, caffeine, sugar, nicotine, highly processed food. This last category is where we feel lonely, we feel isolated, and we have strained relationships. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a few minutes. You'll come on camera for anybody who can, even if you're multitasking, it's fine, but just so I can see you, I am going to pull up the chat now. Can anybody relate to this? Are you picking up what I'm putting down here? Are you seeing yourself in any of this? Can you relate to any of this? Is it familiar to you? Any of you feeling like you want to Photoshop your face, put your face in the middle of it? You could give this for the holidays or Hanukkah or whatnot. Laminate it for your loved ones. Okay, so folks are able to relate to this. Good, good, good. Okay, wonderful. Good, just reading what's coming in, super helpful. Okay. Okay, excellent. Does anybody have any questions for me before we move on? Is anything confusing or not making sense to you? Okay, so let's move on then. When I think about strategies in terms of how we create a sustainable existence for ourselves, so personally, how do we sustain? And with our caretaking, how do we sustain? And in our jobs, how do we sustain? How do we sustain, right? When I think about this, okay, one of the things I'm assuming, I want you to know that one of the things I'm assuming is that you all are short on time, energy, inspiration, capacity, and cash. Okay, so if any of you have like a ton of time and lots of cash, you're going to email me later. I'm going to come up with some additional suggestions for you in terms of strategies. But what I want to cover right now are the kind of desperate times, desperate measures strategies. Most of these I will be going through in our workshop together, but I want to cover a couple of them right now. And just while I'm thinking about it, for anybody I'm not going to be in the workshop with, I want to make sure you all have my contact information so you know that you're welcome to be in touch with me for anything after this. So I'm going to put it in the chat right now. Trauma Stewardship is our website. Okay, so traumastewardship.com. I just put it in the chat. Some of you I'll get to be in the workshop with, some of you I will not. For anybody this goes, just I avail myself to you after our time together at this conference for any way I can be of support to you personally or professionally. Please know that you can be in touch with me for anything. We answer everything that comes in. If you don't hear back, it's because we didn't have your contact information. It didn't come through to us. So try again, or Heather and Shelly have my cell number and my contact information as well. Okay, so trauma stewardship is how you can reach me. There's a TED Talk there, there's some interviews there, there's the handouts that they've provided you for this conference, some additional handouts. So all of that is there, all right? The other thing I just want to mention is we have a podcast called Future Tripping, all right? And the Instagram for that is at Future Tripping with Laura. Okay, so the podcast is Future Tripping. That's on all your favorite platforms. You can also connect with it via our site. And the Instagram is at Future Tripping with Laura. The podcast is all about overwhelm, navigating overwhelm, interrupting isolation around overwhelm. It's for adults, it's for young adults, it's for adolescents, all right? Pitching a very wide tent, okay? And every week we have somebody join me and talk about overwhelm. Sometimes it's people talking about it in their own lives, right? And sometimes it's folks who have specialties in this. So we had a whole episode on narcissism. What's not to join and love about that episode, right? We had an episode on depression and anxiety. We had an episode on toxic, unhealthy, abusive relationships. We also had the head of mental health for the NBA Players Association come on. We've had a 6-year-old come on and talk about being gender non-binary, right? We've had a number of people come on and talk about all different things. And what the common theme is interrupting isolation around overwhelm. So it's a place that you can come to weekly and just get some support and get some good company around interrupting your isolation around overwhelm. Okay, so that podcast is Future Tripping. The Instagram is at Future Tripping with Laura. And then the website for how to reach us is Trauma Stewardship. Okay, so when I think about strategies, okay, one of the things, like I said, is that I'm going to assume you're short on time, energy, inspiration, all of that. So how I think about it is bringing it to our nervous system, bringing it to a very foundational level of our nervous system. Strategy number one is what we just did. That circle is strategy number one, because first and foremost, to be able to like change anything, we have to have some self-awareness and understanding of how we're impacted. So that's strategy number one, is that circle. Don't put it on your refrigerator, slip it under your laptop, put it in a drawer if you're based at home, have a little calendar alert, remind you to check in on it. If you're in your workplace, I would post it a lot of places. Okay. Now, next strategies are when I think about what's the most efficient, effective way to come at this, I think about our nervous system, which I want to suggest to you. I think about your actual nervous system. How do you tend to your actual nervous system? But I also think it could be helpful for you to think about where you live has a nervous system. Where you spend time with your loved ones has a nervous system. Your community has a nervous system. Anywhere you work has a nervous system. right? Your region has a nervous system. Our country has a nervous system. So there's your nervous system, but then if you imagine there's all these other nervous systems and they are interwoven together. Okay, so here's what happens. You're going through your day. Let's use waves as a metaphor. As you're going through your day, any number of waves are going to arrive in your day. This is just stimuli that's happening in your day. All right. Now, for some of you, your primary waves are going to be loved ones, caretaking, people in your life you're showing up for. For some of you, your primary waves are going to be like job, work responsibilities. For some of you, it's a whole combination. As you're going through your day, these waves are coming into your day. These are just things that you need to tend to. For many of these, your brain is going to say, you're fine, you're chilling, you got it, you don't even need me. Your brain is just going to like take a back seat and be like, you know how to do this, go forth. Okay. But for some of you, there will be waves that come into your day where your brain registers it as potentially overwhelming or a perceived threat. And in those situations, your brain is going to say, yo, hey, pay attention, focus up. This is a perceived threat. This is overwhelming. A very important side note here that I want to over communicate is that experience is personal and subjective. What might feel overwhelming to me and possibly threatening to me, to you all, you could be chilling. I think it has to do with present day. I think it has to do with how we were raised. I believe in intergenerational transmission of trauma and depression and epigenetics. So I think it has to do with any number of things. But just because, if Debbie's overwhelmed, doesn't mean that Scott's going to be overwhelmed, right? And if Ambrosia's feeling maxed out, doesn't mean that Jasmine's going to be maxed out. So this is where we want to have a ton of empathy, a lot of humility, and a beginner's mind. In Buddhism, we talk about beginner's mind. Education, we talk about growth mindset. I have 2 young adult daughters, and one of the things that we try to have is a little mantra as we go through the world every day of like, what I don't know about this is everything, right? So just trying to come from a place of humility, and particularly with this, you can't begin to imagine what is going to be overwhelming for somebody else, maxing somebody else out, feeling threatening to somebody else. Okay, now come back. Here you are, you're going through your day, these waves are coming in. You're gonna have a ton of waves where your brain's like, you're chilling, you got it. You're gonna have some waves where your brain's like, whoa, pay attention. When your brain hits that place of pay attention, this wave hits a threshold of perceived threat or overwhelm, all of this energy is gonna flood into your nervous system. It is going to activate your fight, flight, freeze response. You will have an instinct, just like every other animal, to flee, fight, or go into what we call an immobility response. Okay, but we don't fare as well as other animals for a few reasons. I'm going to just focus on the mid-prefrontal cortex. If you're over the age of 25 and you have an instinct to flee, fight, or shut down, given the magnitude of this wave, right? You're going to have a voice in your head go off that's going to say, hold it together. If you're 25 and younger, God willing, a voice goes off that's going to be softer because your brain hasn't yet transitioned to adult brain, but hopefully a voice is going to go off on some volume. Okay. Now we love executive functioning, we love impulse control, but what I want you to understand is when that voice goes off and tells you to hold it together, it's a braking mechanism, which means that this energy that has come in and is flooding your nervous system, where you're going to have an instinct to flee, fight, or shut down, you won't flee, fight, or shut down because you're going to have a braking mechanism in your brain through your executive functioning that says, hold it together. So what that means is this energy that we need to be released from your nervous system is now not going to be released from your nervous system. Instead, it's going to start cycling in your nervous system, loitering in your nervous system, lingering in your nervous system. What we look at when I talk about trauma, vicarious trauma, and overwhelm is what conditions can you put into place? What conditions do you have in place to help you metabolize everything that's arising in your nervous system? We want you to be able to metabolize this. If you don't metabolize it, you can imagine how few waves have to happen before you get saturated in your nervous system. And saturation, nobody wants that. Total drag is where that circle comes from. But I also want you to remember, you're not going to stay saturated. What happens is you're going to rupture. Some of you are folks where you internalize everything, so your rupture is going to be internal. It will eat away at you. Some of you are folks where your rupture is going to be external. This is me like when I yell at my kids. This is you when you're like not nice to somebody in the community, right? So most of us oscillate between rupturing internally and rupturing externally. So when we look at what the strategies are, there are two approaches. Every day, I want you to look at your day and think, today, what can I do to avoid any unnecessary exposure to things that would otherwise jack up my nervous system, so I have less chance of becoming saturated? And where you can't avoid exposure, then we look at what conditions you put in place to help you metabolize. Okay. So I want to just pause here and I want to ask, is this something you can relate to? Can you relate to that experience of becoming saturated and then rupturing internally, rupturing externally? And do you see this in your household? Do you see this in your community? Do you see it in your job? I can answer on behalf of our country. We're definitely hemorrhaging out and rupturing as a country. But is this something you can relate to, that experience of you feel saturated in your nervous system and then you rupture? Okay, wonderful. For some of you, I'm going to see you in the workshop. We're going to take a break now, so you have time in between now and your workshops. For some of you, I'm going to see you in the workshop. For some of you, you have my contact information. But Jacob, what I would like you to do right now, if you would, Jacob, just for a couple minutes, this other handout that is available to you, and if you can't find it, don't worry, we'll help you find it, but it's the map for managing one's day. And the map for managing one's day walks you through some of the most efficient, most effective, least expensive ways to do those two things I just talked about. One, avoid any unnecessary exposure to things that would otherwise jack up your nervous system. And two, help you metabolize collectively as well as individually, job-wise, work-wise, roles-wise, as well as personally. So Jacob or Heather, would you mind putting up that map for managing one's day, just so folks can get a look at that before we go on break? Great, there it is. Okay, perfect. So there's that map for managing one's day. So for those of you with whom I'm not spending time in the workshop, just know that this is there as a resource. There's so many words on there, not because there's so much to do, but just because we want it to be self-explanatory. So even if we don't spend time together in the workshop, you can walk through that, all right? And it's going to walk you through some of the most efficient, most effective, least expensive strategies to help you sustain. Okay, y'all, I'll see some of you in a little bit. Others of you, you've got my contact information. Go have a wonderful break. I'm going to encourage you during the break, take a screen break, walk away from the screen. Go have some water, go outside, pet a puppy, do some Qigong or Tai Chi, but try to take a screen break because you're going to be on screen a bunch today. And then we'll see you back. Go ahead. So Heather or Shelley,
Yes.
What time? We're starting right back up at 15 after you want to?
We're coming back at 9:15. I want to remind folks that one of these workshops was canceled. Teachers need to take care of themselves by caprice, but we have two other ones. Transforming Trauma, as you know, with Laura, will continue at 9:15. And another one, Self-Care, How Do We Get There From Here, with Jennifer Helseth. So we'll see you back at 9:15. Have a great break.
And Jacob or Heather, I can't save this chat on my end. So Jacob or Heather or Shelley, could you, as the host, save this chat for me and just send it to me? I want to make sure if there's anything in there that was intended for me to see, that I'll be able to see it.
Of course.
That would be really great if you could. And I don't know if there's a way for you to make me host right now so I can save it, just so I can see the direct messages too.
We've got it. Thanks, Laura.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yep. Have a great morning.